I don't think they hear me. Sorry. No, it's okay. I'm talking.
Well, I hear y'all.
Oh, here, I'll hit it. All right, so I'm gonna welcome everyone. I'm Tiffany Edwards. I'm the Springfield City Club's president, and I want to thank you all for being here. And I know we're gonna have some folks joining us on Facebook and other places as well. So today we're gonna have a presentation from some guests that are gonna talk about the efforts to fix and reform Measure 110. And so there's going to be some background information shared, and then just kind of share those efforts. So I'm going to lead you their speaker bios. And so we have Chris Perosa, and he is our Chief Deputy DA, District Attorney with the Lane County District Attorney's Office. Sorry, that was kind of a mouthful. In his time as a Deputy District Attorney, Chris has tried nearly every kind of case, including aggravated murders, sexual assaults, child sexual abuse, robberies, and major assaults. This is the fun stuff. Chris has been a member of Oregon's Uniform Trial Court Rules Committee and an adjunct instructor for the University of Oregon's Prosecution Clinic. Chris received a Bachelor of Science degree from Oregon State University and a law degree from the University of Oregon in 2003. He's also running to be elected as the district attorney for Lane County, so you'll probably see him again in that front. And then also joining us is Paige Richardson, and Paige is the founder and owner of Springwater Partners, whose mission is to help civic, community, and business leaders achieve their goals by providing innovative and effective public affairs and political consulting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to get us started, and then Paige will chime in there as well.
Well, thank you all for having Paige and I. Paige and I didn't actually discuss how we were going to do this today, so I think what I'll do ultimately is just talk to you a little bit about kind of where we find ourselves, what the proposal is that is before the legislature as far as the District Attorney Sheriff's League of Oregon Cities has endorsed our proposal as well. And some other groups are jumping on board to support us. But I largely want to define the issue that we have, that we find ourselves in, and that is that when ballot measure 110, for those of you who don't know, was a measure to ultimately decriminalize hard drugs in the state of Oregon passed, with the promise that there would be a great deal of financial support for things like treatment, we began an experiment that is the first of its kind in the United States of America. And as many of you may have noticed over the course of the last several years, that experiment has been failing us. We've seen all kinds of new drug, and I should say, at the time that ballot measure 110 had passed, the people of the state of Oregon didn't understand that a drug like fentanyl would hit the streets and absolutely become the rage amongst drug users. So it was kind of some bad timing to go along with some what I believe to be bad policy that was being chased by folks largely that came from out of state, because the supporters of ballot measure 110 were a group that Paige can talk about a little bit more. She has more knowledge about it than me, but is largely funded from people out of our state and kind of push this proposal onto us. But what has happened is we've seen that drug addiction in this state has absolutely run rampant. I think we rank second in the country now as far as highest drug addicted population, and dead last in treatment services provided. So the promise that ballot measure 110 ultimately had of providing a bunch of additional treatment services and monies to treatment facilities and programs never has materialized. So the result of that, of course, is that we see our community slowly devolving into a fairly chaotic situation that is marked by increased homelessness, higher crime rates. I can tell you that we here in Lane County have seen our crime rates skyrocket over the course of the last 2 to 3 years in the wake of ballot measure 110. And it is not simply the property crimes that, of course, we've always had high rates of property crimes, but have actually seen increases in that since ballot measure 110. We've also seen our violent crime rate essentially double in the last couple of years. So it's having wide effects on us, and it's gotten to the point where folks within our across our state are now demanding change going forward. And the goal of the proposal that there's two parties that are working. Page is working with the fixed ballot measure 110 initiative that's being led by Max Williams. He's kind of the most prominent person that is associated with that group. And she'll tell you a little bit about their goal and what they're trying to ultimately do. Their efforts prompted in essentially putting together ballot measures. They have dangled out there in front of the Oregon legislature and the people of the state of Oregon what is essentially a threat that if the legislature doesn't do something in this short legislative session that begins in February, they are going to put on the November 2024 ballot at least one measure, if not two or more, that will ultimately go to fixing the problems that exist with our current policy that is represented by ballot measure 110. And that action has prompted, in part because there's a lot of support for their movement. I think it's as high as almost 75% of Oregonians now support some change to ballot measure 110 and specifically recriminalizing drugs. That has prompted a great deal of conversation and concern at the legislature, and ultimately the threat of having this measure drop in November of 2024 has prompted them to take action. So knowing that there is this legislative priority that exists, that they must do something now or ultimately face the prospect of having this ballot measure drop, the legislature has been motivated to try and come to some policy agreements with regard to how we're going to address drugs in our community going forward. And the goal here, both of the fixed ballot measure 110 folks and the sheriffs, chiefs of police, League of Oregon Cities, and District Attorneys Association, is ultimately to get more treatment to more people more quickly. That is our game plan. It is to deliver on the promise of ballot measure 110. And we intend to do that by proposing essentially 11 different proposals that are before the legislature right now. And it really focuses on the idea that the notion of voluntary treatment alone, where people voluntarily are allowed to just come forward to seek treatment, is just not working for this state. It's well intended, and I have no doubt that the people who brought ballot measure 110 to bear had the best of intentions with their policy. I think they were just wrong about the nature of drug addiction and how drug addicts ultimately act. Relying solely upon voluntary drug treatment in the golden age of drugs in the state of Oregon is not going to bring enough people who are drug addicted into the treatment programs that they ultimately need. So what we're doing and what our DA and Sheriff League of Cities proposal ultimately before the legislature is designed to do is to, number one, address the severe addiction crisis that exists in Oregon. Number two, to stem the alarming rise of fentanyl overdoses that we're seeing across our communities, and to curb the detrimental effects of that the crisis is having on community safety. And we intend to do that by a number of different proposals. And the first is that we want to reclassify possession of controlled substances back to a Class A misdemeanor. So in the past, it was, we would prosecute possession of controlled substances like heroin or cocaine or methamphetamine as Class C felonies. Currently, and under the practice in ballot measure 110, it is simply treated as an e-violation, similar to a jaywalking ticket. And the thought process was behind decriminalization is you wouldn't have all these collateral impacts on people's lives by having criminal convictions associated with them having drugs in their possession. The problem has been that the motivators that we ultimately put towards getting people to have treatment have been removed from the process, and they put in place of that, it's essentially a $100 fine that you get as an e-violation. And if you call a hotline to get essentially do an assessment, they'll waive that $100 fine. The problem has been that Paige gave me these statistics, so I'm borrowing on this. The last that any of us had heard, they'd given about 6,000 e-violation tickets for possessing drugs in the state of Oregon since ballot measure 110, and only about 90 people called for an assessment. And of those 90, it's about somewhere between 5 and 10% go and take the next step of ultimately trying to seek some level of treatment for that. So it's just not working. People are not motivated to ultimately address their drug addiction problems. So by reclassifying the possession of controlled substance statutes back into criminal statutes, we can ultimately use the leverage of government for those whose drug use is ultimately impacting not only themselves and their family, but the rest of us in society. We can use the criminal justice system to ultimately motivate them to seek treatment in an involuntary way, but with caveats. What we're trying to do is essentially create some diversionary off-ramps for them, similar to how we're using the DUII system, in that we are trying to, what we want to be able to do is allow law enforcement and groups like Cahoots to make referrals directly to diversionary programs without having to even touch the criminal justice system, meaning that it doesn't land on a prosecutor's desk for prosecution if they agree to enter into a diversionary program on the front end. The second avenue is for police to go through the ordinary cite and arrest process, and then we would get their case, ultimately charge it, and send them through a diversion program through the court systems. And then, of course, if they were to choose to just not engage in any kind of treatment program, we would then send them through the ordinary criminal prosecution process, get a conviction, and in the end, the design of our probationary periods would be to mandate treatment upon them so that they're going to get treatment one way or another, which they're not getting under our current system. The second proposal for us is to include, it's a fix to a bad piece of, it's an appellate court decision that came out that ultimately basically gutted our delivery of controlled substance statutes. And so we're trying to add back language to the delivery definition of the statute so that those who have possession of large quantities of drugs have packaging material, repackaging material, scales, guns, money, all the indicia that a person is engaged in drug dealing, that we can begin to treat those who ultimately are engaged in the distribution of drugs in our community to ultimately give us the tools to prosecute them as such. So it's essentially attacking the supply side of the equation as well. Proposal number 3 for us is to modify the statutory pretrial hold language for Senate Bill 48. For those of you who may have paid attention to the 2021 session, Senate Bill 48 was a proposal that essentially was trying to effectively end the process of pretrial detention for criminals. And unfortunately, it caused, it essentially required that local jurisdictions develop a 3-bucket system, if you could think of it, where people would be immediately released from custody upon booking on their own personal recognizance for certain low-level types of offenses. The second bucket were for more serious offenses like Class C felonies, Class B felonies. They would be allowed to be released nearly immediately on conditional releases. And then there was a third category that would include everything from murder in the first degree, all your most violent sexual assaults and things of that nature, where they are simply held until arraignment, and then a release decision has to be made by the court. And only if the district attorney's office files motions for continued pretrial detention and we can make certain showings to the court, will that person be held pretrial for their crime, which of course is very dangerous. What we've seen ultimately happen here in Lane County and across the state is that people have been released for fairly serious crimes pending their trial, to the detrimental effect of our community, in that those folks are now out there. Imagine if you had somebody who was charged with sexual assault, immediately released from custody, and to be allowed to ultimately go back into the community and potentially reoffend. That's a dangerous circumstance for our community. So what we're trying to address is to fix Senate Bill 48 to require that local judges and the sheriff actually have power and the ability to hold people pre-trial when they deem that that person is somebody who is a threat to the rest of us in society. They don't have that control under Senate Bill 48 right now. The sheriff, despite all the community complaints about DAs or the sheriff letting people out, I'll let you know the DA and sheriff have no control on who gets held pre-trial in our community right now. Proposal number 4 for us is to fund county probation departments to supervise misdemeanor theft and property related crimes. There are studies that suggest that 50 to 80% of the property crimes that are committed in our communities are committed by people who are drug addicted, and they're essentially stealing from you to be able to fund their own addiction problems. And so one of the things that we ultimately need to have in place in order for us to be effective in preventing additional crime here in our community, both at the property level and others, is the ability to have there be supervisory authority over these folks once convicted for these types of crimes. That supervisor, the probation officer, would be allowed to then mandate them into treatment and be able to keep track of how they're doing with regard to their court-ordered obligations on supervision, and specifically, how are they doing to complete the treatment program that's been ordered by either them or the court directly. So beefing up our ability to have robust parole and probation for these people is going to be especially important going forward. The 5th proposal is to create a new Class A misdemeanor for public use of a controlled substance. So suffice it to say that open drug use in our community is having a devastating effect on the psychology of our community, and specifically to our kids who are watching this happen. It is normalizing the behavior of drug use in our community. And we need to be able to have a mechanism, a toehold for the government to ultimately go in and say, you're not permitted to use controlled substances openly in public. And if you do so, we are going to arrest you. You are going to be sent into the criminal justice system for the purpose of treatment. It would be designated as a drug-related crime, and therefore subject to the ability to have a parole officer that would ultimately supervise these people, and we would give them the options of ultimately doing the diversionary programs that are available to the possession of controlled substance folks. So again, we're trying to create a contact point to ultimately get treatment in these people's lives. Our sixth proposal, and I'm trying to move quickly, I want to leave Paige plenty of time, is to create a new Class A misdemeanor for use of a controlled substance in an enclosed public space that would endanger other people. I think you guys would all be surprised to learn that there was a great deal of concern amongst our mass transit facilities, the employees of our mass transit facilities, that they were finding evidence of drug use within their vehicles and in their facilities itself. And so Portland, Seattle, and a couple of other communities asked the University of Oregon to ultimately come in and conduct a research project to see what is the prominence of drugs in our mass transit systems I think they use the 5 biggest mass transits in the Pacific Northwest. And what they found was startling. They found methamphetamine was found on 98% of surfaces in mass transit facilities and vehicles, and in 100% of air samples that they took in there. With regard to fentanyl, they found that it was on 46% of the surfaces that they tested, and 25% of the air samples in those transit facilities. That's a very startling number. And as you're aware, anytime somebody chooses against your will to ultimately use a drug like fentanyl in your presence and against your will, they are ultimately playing Russian roulette with your life. So we want to have a Class A misdemeanor that ultimately allows us to be able to prosecute those people who are endangering the lives of other people against their will in open public spaces. Again, this would be designated as a drug-related misdemeanor, so we would have the ability to have a probationary officer work with them, and drug treatment would be the focus of that prosecution. Then we move to what we consider to be our treatment community-focused solutions. Proposal number 7 is to prioritize adequate and sustainable funding for Oregon specialty courts. Our treatment courts have been really effective in addressing drug addiction in our community. Our treatment courts currently include our drug court, our mental health court, and our veterans court. And these are very intensive programs that can last up to 18 months, where a whole team of people, including the court and supervising officers and things of that nature, work collaboratively together to address and tailor a program for each individual who participates based on their specific needs. And of course, there is a drug treatment component or a mental health component to all of our various treatment courts, specialty courts. Those are coming under threat currently. There isn't enough funding, and we're having a tough time finding people willing to do the arduous work to ultimately address their mental health issues, their drug addictions, or some of the collateral consequences that we've seen from associated with being a veteran, which could include substance abuse and mental health issues. So we want to bolster those courts and their efficacy as much as we possibly can. Proposal number 8 is to create the authority to utilize welfare holds for people for up to 72 hours if they're intoxicated, or ultimately if they're demonstrating mental health problems. They're held essentially under this proposal. They would be held in a custodial environment and given supervised medical care. After 72 hours, that person is allowed, they have the option. They can either leave or they can stay and receive additional services. But it's a touch point again with these folks to ultimately be able to offer them after they've had some time of sobriety and clarity, offer them the ability to get into a treatment program and have some treatment programs available for them to be shepherded into. Again, we're trying to create pipelines to treatment for these folks. Proposal number 9 is to create adequate stabilization, detoxification, and treatment capacity within jurisdictions across the state. This has been an identified problem for us here in Lane County, and Lane County government in particular is working on having their own stabilization center, but realistically, we're probably 18 to 24 months away from that becoming a reality. And money is a big part of that problem. So we're trying to encourage the legislature to ultimately fund stabilization centers in communities across the state of Oregon. Again, this would be another way to create a pipeline to treatment for these affected people. Proposal number 10 for us is to support the creation of an opioid overdose quick response team. And this is modeled after a Cincinnati project that they ran from 2015 to 2019. It's a team, a specialized team of people that would go out to folks that, in ideal world, the best practice is to meet with them at least 72 hours after they had an overdose episode, when people are vulnerable and more willing to listen about treatment and things of that nature, and talk to them about what services exist out there to ultimately try and get them to see the light, go to a treatment facility program. In Cincinnati, they had 80% engagement with assessments and treatment when that was ultimately done. So there is the potential for having another avenue to get some of these drug addicted people into treatment programs if we did this. And I'll tell you right now, anecdotally, I've been talking to our police and fire department routinely lately, and they are giving out Narcan doses to people at alarming rates. One of my good close friends who's a fireman here in Eugene, Springfield, said that just a couple of weeks ago, they gave one individual 3 doses of Narcan. I mean, they had to come 3 times to try and address an individual who was overdosing in one shift. So we want to create another avenue to touch these people and ultimately give them the option to get into treatment programs. And then finally, we want to support aligning the city of residential and secure residential facilities with the requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Another part of this whole problem that we have in our society is we do have a housing problem. And I'm not suggesting, I would never suggest that housing isn't a component of our homeless problem that we have here. But one of the problems that communities are running into time and again is that anytime they find funding to ultimately put together a facility for residential treatment or non-secure residential treatment, they ultimately are running into all kinds of impediments to actually building the facilities that they have funding for. In part based on the kind of NIMBY principle. Nobody wants a treatment facility in their backyard, but we have to build them, and we have to build them somewhere. So we're hoping that we can use the federal standard here in the state of Oregon to allow us to be able to build these facilities that are so needed for all of us. Those are the proposals that the DAs, sheriffs, chiefs of police, and the League of Oregon Cities have come forward with. I'm going to yield to Paige now to talk about her group and what they're doing.
Oh, hang on. There.
Yeah, I bet there's questions. I will pause because I'm guessing you all tell me when to start going here.
So Paige, why don't you go ahead and then we'll do Q&A at the end and I'll facilitate that. And so you go ahead and present.
Okay, perfect. Let me make sure. Okay, screen share. I'm going to use a deck here, folks, and try to skip over the pieces that Chris covered, where we have overlap, and so that we can get to questions. So I'm here from the Fix and Improve Measure 110 Coalition. We're a group of Oregonians who, like maybe many of you, have become more and more concerned about the level of not just drug use, but the overdose and death rates, the impact on those individuals, their families, and our communities as a whole from this. So here's a little bit of the who, what, when, and how. There's some why in here as well. The why, I think Chris has gone over, you all know it, but specifically we're not attacking we mean in no way to attack proponents of 110 and current supporters of 110, but we think changes need to be made. There are some unintended consequences. They did not anticipate what would happen with fentanyl, or frankly, many places in the US still don't understand the nature of these synthetic drugs and how easy it is to make them, how cheap they are to get out in the world. Unanticipated challenges, I sort of just covered that. So the consequences are larger than they thought. The challenges are bigger than they thought. And the expectations were frankly unrealistic for Oregon. We have been sadly last in the nation for a number of years in the availability of mental health and addiction treatment beds, facilities, behavioral health in general has struggled here. And Measure 110, what I think most of us had no idea about when we were trying to figure out whether we were going to vote for it or not, was the implementation timeline was only 90 days. So literally from the November election of 2020, every part of 110 went into effect 90 days later, which is essentially at the end of January after nobody, and so there was no way to get money out the door to build more treatment, no way to have law enforcement really effectively be prepared for this, given that they were going to lose tools. So that's the why. Then who are we? We're hundreds of Oregonians, and I hope that becomes thousands who haven't heard about us yet, but folks all over the state who are alarmed by the rapidly increasing use, overdose, death rates, community harm of the increased open use. And again, let me reiterate, we are caring people who want folks to get support, but what is happening now is terrible. This is the picture in this slide. This is the cover of the Wall Street Journal on November 11th. And, you know, we see it in Portland, you see it in Eugene, we're seeing it in other communities. And this is not the way to handle this. We were catalyzed by a handful of folks who understand the dynamics of policy, politics, campaigns, and communications, and we're not seeing action. We're not seeing urgency. And so we decided to, stir the pot by creating this coalition and filing ballot measures that could go to the 2024 November ballot in order to make some changes that a set of experts that we talked with around the state suggested would help us improve on some things that the writers of 110 never even considered, and then also put some guardrails back on and return tools to law enforcement. We are funded entirely by Oregonians, particularly the major funders. It's all public. You can find it. You will know the names of some of them, two in particular, Phil Knight, or Uncle Phil, as people sometimes call him in Oregon, Tim Boyle of Columbia, and then a lot of local business owners who are, being really hurt by this, but also their families are being impacted by it as well. But they have the ability to jump in, and they were willing to help us get this thing kicked off. Who brought us Measure 110? I think this is important, and you see this. The Drug Policy Alliance brought Measure 110 to Oregon. We have always been innovators. The best part of Oregonians is this innovative spirit on lots of topics. We were the first in the nation in the 70s to to work on marijuana policy to, I think, decriminalize it. The Drug Policy Alliance, though, this is straight from their website. They have their good intentions are in the war on drugs and get better outcomes for people, but the way it's definitely, I do not speak for them about them. I know what I read on their website and what they're talking about in Oregon. This is right off of their website. They're looking for legal regulation and safer supply, which means they are in favor of legalizing all drugs and then let people make choices. Or certainly, and that's what they've done here, and they have not said, no, we're not for that. And they also are not supporting any of the changes we're making. So I think that's important to note. Here are the 4 pillars of effective drug policy, which I kind of, when you say it, when you read them here, you're like, oh, yes, that totally makes sense. But I didn't have them cataloged in my head exactly before I got started on this. And the reason, I was catalyzed to act because I grew up in West Virginia and still have friends and family there in West Virginia for a long time, has led the nation in overdose and death rates. And it's not because we're a state filled with people with lower education rates and whose incomes are also lower and struggle, which that is true. But the problems there were created by a legal market coming in, creating addicts and then an illegal market coming in to expand the existing market and continue to fill the need of those addicts. And I started to see that happening here, even before 110. Okay, so prevention, enforcement, treatment, harm reduction. Largely, Measure 110 so far has provided funding for harm reduction, peer support, and we count treatment and peer support as a part of treatment. Like anything that'll keep you from using is treatment. The medical community has a different definition of that, but much like what Chris was saying, we're just looking for ways to get people to make a different choice. And for sure, it is going to take, for many addicts, most addicts of anything, it takes more than one time to change your pattern, particularly of these new synthetic drugs. We believe that this is a crisis, not an implementation hiccup. Currently, the supporters of Measure 110 and the proponents of who are keeping, like leaving everything as it is, their theory seems to be that we should just roll with it and things will get better as we build more treatment. And many of you may be following this closely, but took a long time for the first money to roll out. It's going to take a long time to build that infrastructure. So we're now leading we have the steepest increase in the death rate of teenagers now in Oregon in the nation, because none of us also realized, I don't think, that this would apply to kids. And it does. Chris can verify if I get this wrong. Right now, if an officer sees a young person with alcohol, they have something they can do about that. They can call the parents, they can take them home. There's going to be a misdemeanor charge associated with that. If your child is on the street now smoking fentanyl, there's nothing that can be done. Here's our policies and principles. They're very similar to where the cities and DAs and sheriffs and chiefs have come to. We want a better system than what Oregon had before Measure 110. The reason Measure 110 passed is because we were behind. And so the treatment money, the harm reduction money, that's all super important. But we need to add back enforcement and we need to include prevention, because that is the most effective way that any expert will tell you to stay away from this problem, is to have fewer people get into it. Leave the treatment money where it is. We're in favor of creating a center of excellence, so that there is a set of people who are only thinking about this and creating a whole system of behavioral health, the continuum of care that then includes our law enforcement communities. I think you all have done a fairly decent job, or over in Eugene with Cahoots. That seems to be, it certainly is a groundbreaking program, and is doing much better than many other cities right now. Like in Portland, where I live, all the police can do is write tickets that nobody is keeping or using. Realigning resources so we get prevention and community harm, and then building better systems. I'm gonna have to take a break and let Chris jump in. I'm recovering from a cold here.
I'm happy to take questions at this point. If anyone has them, I wouldn't be surprised if there were questions or concerns.
It sounds like we have a couple in here, but Chris, if we can hang out for just,
Sure.
because if you want to just talk about these two approaches, because I think this is like really important, and I think then we can take questions.
Sure. So the goal here is, first and foremost, is to get the legislature to ultimately address this issue, because ballot measures, while they are great on kind of generalized concepts, they often, our legislatures can sit and actually do a better job of figuring out how various things will work together so that they are more productive going forward. And Paige and the Fix Ballot Measure 110 group recognize that. They know that a ballot measure is going to be clumsy at some level ultimately, and it's not going to ultimately have all of the nuances of how to approach fixing the problem. It's just not going to do as good a job ultimately, and it's going to force the legislature then to react to kind of a broad set of proposals, as opposed to getting in there, working with one another to ultimately create a new policy, a new procedure to address the specific problems we have within the Oregon system. So what the Ballot Measure 110 folks are really trying to do is provide a backup plan, that if the legislature fails to address this issue in the way that Oregonians would want to see addressed, they're ready to come in and drop their ballot measures to force the legislature's hand in the future. The problem for us is that we are in a short session in 2024 for the legislature, and ballot measures can only be brought forward in the November election of every even year. So if they don't scramble and put it on the ballot for November 2024, they'd have to ultimately either trust that the legislature is going to do something shortly thereafter, like in the full session of 2025, or they'd have to wait till November 2026 to ultimately do things. So their measure is designed to put pressure on the legislature to act in this short session. That's really what their goal is. And they're hoping that, and I think the legislature's got the message, this is the big debate up in Salem right now. And there are all kinds of groups that have been formed to ultimately try and see if some compromise can be worked out.
Thank you for jumping in. I so appreciate that. And that's exactly right. We had to do both at once, because if the legislature does fail to act and we miss November of 24, we could be late into 25 or even 26 before we made corrections. And we just cannot wait. We are in the camp of people who like, no, we cannot wait. So I think Chris described accurately where we are. The legislature's paying attention. They're looking at fixes. We like the policy that was just that Chris outlined, and that would be fine with us. If the legislature passed that, we would be done and out. There are a set of legislators that are concerned about overcorrection and disparities in enforcement based on race, and there's reason for them to be concerned about that. But we're hoping that we can get them in conversation with some of the successful programs like Cahoots, like Lincoln County, and Bend. Actually, Bend also, I think, has a great program where this is working, and it is the lightest possible touch. And you're just looking for, come on, let's get you the opportunity to get back to be able to make a good choice for yourself. Our best case scenario is the legislature. The worst case is we go to the ballot. 74% of Oregon voters support recriminalization and some sort of mandatory intervention or treatment. And the medical experts back this up with particularly fentanyl and meth. The fentanyl takes weeks to finally work out of your system. Meth does as well. It's the new meth. It is not the Breaking Bad version. The stuff and fentanyl. If you haven't, taken a look at how it works, maybe it's too hard to look at, frankly, but we all know it's deadly. But it's so easy to make, so that the drug sellers and the cartels who are promoting this product, it's not the same as cocaine and heroin that starts from a plant. You just cook it in a lab like meth, and the precursors are easy to get. You can find a recipe on the internet. So we've got to rein this thing in. I'm going to leave this up for a second so you all can take a look, and I'm going to stop for questions for either of us.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paige. And I'm just gonna say, I would encourage anybody who's interested, they do have a place where you can sign up to get their emails and whatnot. And they have a lot of really great information. I just signed up because I wanted to get the articles and things like that. So it was a great place to do a lot of research.
Thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate it. Yeah, please do. You all, the legislature's going to be looking for testimony. If you want changes made, this session, it'd be important for your voice to be heard, and we can help make sure that happens for you. So please come over, sign up, and we'll keep you up to date on things.
Okay, cool. So a couple questions online. Len, go ahead.
Actually, they're both for Chris in a way, and they cover the opposite. One end of the spectrum. The first question is, how would your proposals, and I guess Paige's as well, affect the ability of the district attorney to prosecute crimes overall? Is it going to tax the system that much?
It is, absolutely. There's no doubt anytime you add, and many of you probably saw the news as last night on KZI regarding us just opening up to getting back to the point where we can prosecute some low-level offenses that we had previously said we weren't prosecuting. That really was driven by a different issue ultimately on why we weren't able to prosecute. That was because we lost 15 prosecutors in 18 months, and we only start with 24 in our community. So we lost a ton of experienced prosecutors, and ultimately were unable for a long period of time to hire back. And through some help from the Board of County Commissioners, and then ultimately some kind of big efforts on our part to ultimately go out and find some experienced prosecutors, we've been able to build our office back to a point where we are now fully staffed. It is going to be a strain on us, but the hope is that if we can get these people into diversionary programs, we're ultimately not going to have a great deal of touch on these cases to begin with. If we can divert their cases, it takes no more effort from us than to review the initial police reports to determine whether or not there has been, there's sufficient evidence to ultimately charge this person with the crime, and there hasn't been any constitutional violations of their rights. And then we file a charge against them, and they are diverted into this treatment program system. So there isn't a great deal of work from our individual attorneys unless they choose not to engage in treatment. And then we go through the ordinary prosecution process. I'll tell you, this is so significant, and it affects so many of the other, our crime rate as a whole, this drug addiction problem we have within our community and around the state, that I'm absolutely dedicated to trying to make this work. And we will be prosecuting these cases, because if we can stop the addiction from a person that ultimately would otherwise steal from you or assault you out on the street, we're preventing additional crimes and victimization. So we are committed to making this work if the legislature chooses to ultimately adopt these proposals.
I just want to
The
add
second-
can I just add one thing to, for folks to consider? We absolutely
ahead.
have a public defender shortage that needs to be addressed, but we're losing 100 people a month to accidental drug overdoses in Oregon right now. And that number is we're doing nothing to change that. And so the cost of doing nothing is also significant. And we have ways of getting funding to get additional public defense folks. It's just a question of, are we going to wait till we have a perfect system and people keep dying, while people are dying?
And the second Facebook question is exactly what Paige raised from the offender defendant's perspective. Is this going to put Lane County in the same situation as a lot of the other counties, having difficulty getting adequate public defenders so that they can bring people, they can represent people and not have them sort of fall out of the system?
Yeah. So we've been fortunate in Lane County that we haven't run into the same types of problems with our public defense system that, say, Multnomah County or Washington County have fallen into. It would definitely put some additional strain on there, but I need to note one thing. We have 24 criminal division prosecutors in Lane County, and there are I think now over 50 public defenders in our community. So they have more than twice the staff that we have ultimately. For example, the public defense services, they have 30, at last count, I think they have 32 or 33 attorneys in public defense services for Lane County. And they only do 60% of the work, the public defense work for indigent defenders. And then we have a private group called the consortium that ultimately picks up the remainder in our area. So they have us more than double as far as manpower. I'm not suggesting that there won't be some tax, some toil ultimately on their system, but the people that they have hired in the last few 12 months or so, according to my discussions with Brooke Reinhardt, who's the executive director for Public Defender Services, for example, is that they have a ton of capacity to take on additional cases at this case level. Where they're really struggling is on higher case levels: murders, sexual assault, major robberies and assaults and things like that. That's where they run into trouble because there's an artificial system in place that determines how much a public defense attorney can handle in a particular year. And those cases that are bigger in nature, particularly Jessica's Law cases and murder cases, Jessica's Law is when essentially sex crimes against children, they account for a huge amount of your potential total that you can take in a year. So they have tons of, my understanding is they have quite a bit of capacity at this lower level to take additional cases. And so we don't think we're going to have the dramatic impact on the public defense system here in Lane County that they may have in other communities. But we're going to have to address the public defense crisis going forward anyway. And in fact, they put a lot of effort into doing that already.
Does anyone else have?
Well, that's just remember, that's an important piece. The changes we're suggesting are nobody's going to get a felony charge. These are light misdemeanor touch, and some of them are pre-trial. It's meant to be pre-trial. So it's basically like you have to make this choice. Person who's seen using in public or brought in for some other reason, it comes to the attention of the police. Treatment, probation, like they're simple. They're very simple because we're not looking to make somebody guilty. We're looking to get people help.
Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
So,
Yeah, you mentioned hope.
sorry, Celine was, I'll let you go last. We'll wrap it up.
So the transit-related statistic that you cited is certainly alarming to me as somebody who tries to prioritize taking the bus. I was wondering if you have any insights though on what the actual potential health impacts are to people of that sort of secondhand exposure?
Yeah, the study, so having read the study, and maybe Paige can talk about this. I'm certainly not qualified to talk about the medical risks of that contact. More importantly for me is it's just a startling statistic, right? That those who, those in the public that would ultimately choose to use mass transit or potentially any other public facility may be unknowingly subjecting themselves to exposure to methamphetamine or fentanyl or potentially some other drug.
It's an evolving sort of set of research, right? Because fentanyl is newer on the scene, but for sure there's, secondhand smoke of any kind is bad, and a lot of the fentanyl use now is being smoked. The study was done by the University of Washington because the transit drivers are getting sick, and they thought that it was probably because in Portland metro region and up in Seattle, sadly, they are often, late at night, great places to use drugs and stay dry and stay warm and stay moving. And so there's the impact, and remember, like any amount of fentanyl, you touch the foil, you can get in trouble if there's any live fentanyl left on it. Like it's a real danger and a real, frustration for the drivers, and more people need to know about it. I'm not trying to scare people away from transit, but you've got to really be careful. We have a lot of anecdotal stories, a child who went with her mom on the MAX train up in Portland, sat on a needle. The needle had fentanyl on it, and the child was treated for fentanyl exposure, and now is on a 7-year watch list for hepatitis C and HIV. And so it's gotten out of control. Now you also check your own systems in Lane County and see what's happening. You can test them. The University of Washington would probably be happy to advise on that, but just keep your eyes open for where use is, and do be careful about it. There isn't a lot of evidence on what happens if you touch the residue, like particularly of meth, like the surface areas that tested really positive. Anything that's in the air is bad, y'all. And I've talked to a pulmonologist, a lung doctor about that. Not good.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Paige. We have one quick question and then we'll wrap it up.
It's a quick one. I'm just wondering, you said that Measure110 preceded fentanyl, and I'm wondering what the portion of the problem of drug use is due to fentanyl versus, the ones that have been around forever.
Right. It's not that fentanyl preceded it. It's
Right.
just that the explosion of the problem, it wasn't apparent at the time of the drafting of 110 that we were going to find ourselves in a position where overdoses were going to explode to the level that they ultimately did, or that the number of people that we see using out in our community were going to be using fentanyl as opposed to methamphetamine, which would have been the drug du jour for a lot of folks for a long, long time.
There were a lot of people who predicted that this is what would happen, and they opposed Measure110 actively. That wasn't able to be a big enough voice. 2020 was a crazy year, and on every level, politically, health wise, and so they couldn't get their voice loud enough to say, you're going to put an open sign on Oregon for cartel activity and drug importation and selling. And that the 110 folks they definitely didn't anticipate that.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it at that. I want to thank you both. Incredibly insightful information. I've had the privilege of having it a few times now, but it's alarming and shocking. And so if anyone has other questions, by all means, I know how to reach out to our speakers and we can kind of continue the conversation. And we probably will have some similar topics before this group in the coming months, I would think, as we're leading up to that session and then beyond to see, what ends up happening in February. So with that, I want to thank everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Paige. All right. I know, I feel like I can give the presentation better.
You probably.
Between you